Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. And today we've got a really interesting, some of its history, some of its theory question. So the question was, where was Battleship New Jersey during Able Archer 83? And I honestly had never heard of Able Archer 83, so I had to look this up, and led me down all sorts of compelling rabbit holes. So, the answer to this is I believe Able Archer 83 was the closest that Battleship New Jersey ever came to being sunk. Able Archer was a series of annual exercises that NATO's command staff would run from their command bunker in Belgium. It was an exercise to simulate command and control communications during a hypothetical World War III scenario. And so over the course of about a week, and this one takes place in November of 1983, NATO's staff would run through a projected Soviet invasion, all the things that they always assumed was going to happen. The Soviets would come storming through the Fulda Gap and all of that, and NATO would collapse back on itself as they're waiting for more reinforcements to come, so on and so forth. And then the exercise ends the way all of these exercises ended, with a stalemate that then results in a nuclear war. So this was an annual exercise that NATO did just about every year, and they publicized that they were going to be running this exercise so that it didn't escalate to a war or anything through any sort of miscommunication. But this is the year 1983, and it's happening at the end of the year at a point when there has been a whole lot of tension building up between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Many historians now consider Able Archer 83 to be the second closest that humanity has ever come to a nuclear war after the Cuban Missile Crisis some 20 years earlier. On the one hand, you have the Secretary General of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Yuri Andropov, who is literally dying of kidney failure in a hospital during this event. But he is someone who has never visited the West. And then on the other hand, you've got a series of Western leaders who are, in some ways, intentionally escalating things, which is concerning the Soviet Union. Both sides thinks that the other is going to be the first to initiate an attack. And honestly, as an American here in America, we do not give enough credit to the Soviet Union and how much they worked to prevent a war. NATO always assumed that the evil empire, and evil empire is a key word that's going to come up here in a second, was going to come storming across Western Europe. And by the same token, the Soviet Union always assumed that NATO was going to expand through. And you have a bunch of Western leaders who had never been to the Soviet Union, and you have a lot of Soviet leaders who had never been to the Western countries. So the escalation of tensions starts with President Reagan making a speech in which he calls the Soviet Union the evil empire.
To ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding, and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil.
And he uses a lot of rhetoric like that throughout both his campaign and the first 2 years of his presidency. And honestly, it's very provocative language, as if he's trying to provoke either his people to action or the Soviet Union. He also threatens to relegate them to the ash can of history, the dustbin of history, something like that. So again, these Soviet leaders are getting the impression that the United States-led NATO alliance is opposed to them, has taken this radical shift, and is becoming more and more offensive. Along with this, the United States is being more provocative in that they're having aircraft fly right up to Soviet airspace to collect as much signals intelligence data as possible and then turn around. And this is happening throughout the year. It happens several times. And then a South Korean airliner strays off of its proper course into legitimate Soviet airspace. And the Russians shoot it down, believing it's an American aircraft. That further escalates tension because now the West is talking about how they're attacking civilian airliners, and they're talking about how the West is intentionally penetrating their airspace. And they don't believe this is actually a civilian airliner. It was probably collecting signals intelligence. There's a series of other escalations like this happening throughout the year, but probably the biggest one is the United States invades Grenada, which had a fledgling communist government in charge. What makes that so provocative is that the British then sent a bunch of secure transmissions to the Americans being like, hey, the Queen of England is the head of state of Grenada. Why did you just invade? And Reagan being like, they're communists in the Western Hemisphere. Sorry, didn't mean to do that without consulting you. Anyway, so this is new signals traffic that the Soviets hadn't seen before, but it's between heads of state. And they can't exactly decode it, but they know there's some weird stuff going on between two nuclear powers that are their enemies. And then the United States develops the Pershing II missile, which is a medium-range nuclear-armed missile that they're going to deploy to Western Europe, which takes something like 8 minutes to fly from Germany to Moscow, which means that the Russians will have virtually no time between when their sensors detect a nuclear launch to when they are able to retaliate before these Pershing missiles, which are intentionally designed to decapitate the Soviet Union's command and control capabilities. So they have to put out the order to fire a retaliatory volley in that 8-minute span. So the Soviet Union stops looking for actual missile launches as proof that there's been a missile fired, because that doesn't give them enough time, and instead start to look at some of the key determining factors that would preempt a missile launch, like communications between heads of states, like NATO's command staff going to a nuclear-hardened underground bunker. And that's exactly what happens during Exercise Able Archer. Now again, this is a publicized exercise. The United States and NATO doesn't try to hide what's going on because they think that would be more provocative. But keep in mind, within living memory, in June of 1941, during what was posted as an exercise, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. All the heads of the Soviet Union were alive at that point. They'd survived that invasion. And so they believe that it's entirely possible that a Western nation would invade them under the guise of an exercise. Also during this time period, a Soviet missile detection system does detect multiple missile launches from the United States. However, the lieutenant colonel in charge of that detection system correctly assumes that if it's only 3 or 4 missile launches, that there's no way that it's an actual first strike all-out attack, and it must be his equipment malfunctioning. That ended up being accurate, but that certainly didn't help his career. But it does go to show that the Soviet Unions were working just as hard as Western countries at preventing a war. Nobody wanted a World War III. Here we are at the end of a year that there's been a lot of ratcheting up of tensions. The Soviet Union neither has the time to rely on their missile launch sensors nor trust in their missile launch sensors. And they start to receive a bunch of signals intelligence that indicates that NATO is doing something. They're getting all these communications from a command bunker in Belgium at NATO's headquarters. And the person in charge of the Soviet Union at this point is leading from a hospital bed as he is dying. He's like 2 months away from dying at this point. And he's the former head of the KGB, so he is somebody who both relies on signals intelligence and is trained in making decisions based on his interpretations of signals intelligence. At the end of the day, the Soviet Union does not launch what they believed was a retaliatory strike. against NATO for what they thought was a possible nuclear launch. And NATO doesn't even realize how close to war they came until years later as more information is declassified. This is one of those junction points in history that historians like to theorize about as to what would have happened if we went to a nuclear war. And so that's where the question comes from. Where was New Jersey during exercise Able Archer 83? At this point, Battleship New Jersey is the only active battleship anywhere in the world. And she's off the coast of Lebanon. The Beirut barracks attack had just happened the month prior, so New Jersey is doing very visible donuts off the coast of Beirut, standing by for when she will eventually be allowed to retaliate. And the ship will be able to fire back, but that's still a couple of months away. That's another thing. After the Beirut barracks bombing, the U.S. steps up its security on bases around the world, which could be in response to that barracks bombing, or it could also look like they're about to start a war, and so they're going to a heightened security level. So, let's say the Soviet Union misinterprets things and decides that they have to launch a retaliatory strike. There are two possibilities. One is an all-out strategic missile attack where you are trying to destroy, say, American cities. The second is a tactical missile attack where you want to do some damage to the enemy, but you don't necessarily want to escalate things to all-out nuclear annihilation. The doctrine of both the United States and Soviet Union allowed for first strikes under certain parameters, but it's likely, in my opinion, more likely that it would have been a tactical strike against a non-nuclear area. If you launch a nuclear missile into Great Britain, the British are going to launch their nuclear weapons back. But if you launch a nuclear weapon into Germany, Germany doesn't have any nuclear weapons, and the United States and Great Britain and France may not retaliate for something like that. You've now fired into a NATO country and showed that, and postured, but it may not be enough that things would escalate. Or maybe if they do escalate, it would only be Poland or Ukraine that's nuked, and not the Soviet Union proper. And that's why I think this is the most dangerous time for the United States. Things like our nuclear ballistic missile submarines or our carrier battle groups are mobile. The Soviets don't necessarily know where they are on November 11th, 1983, when Able Archer is coming to its apex. But if they want to do a major politicized, very visual thing, they know exactly where one American capital ship is. Battleship New Jersey doing donuts in the Mediterranean Sea off the coast of Lebanon.
The missile range.
She is very conveniently located within intermediate missile range of Europe. They have observers in Beirut that can see exactly where the ship is, so they can provide that targeting information. Battleship New Jersey is not missile armed at this time. While she has the missile systems installed, she's still several months away from having conventional Tomahawks installed, and no nuclear Tomahawks have yet been manufactured. So she's relatively unarmed except for her older gun systems. She also has very little defensive capability, 4 phalanxes to shoot down incoming missiles. So that's why I consider this to be the closest Battleship New Jersey ever came to being sunk. During battles like Truk Lagoon or Iwo Jima and Okinawa, she could have been hit by a kamikaze or a torpedo or something like that. But no single hit like that was going to sink the battleship. There weren't any sustained attacks made against her. But the Soviet Union having that targeting information and potentially needing to use a tactical missile to try and stop NATO from invading them, she would have made the perfect target. You're only targeting military equipment and military personnel. It's in the middle of the ocean, so there isn't going to be a whole lot of collateral damage, at least as far as nuclear attacks go. And it's a very high-profile target. But at the end of the day, it's not a particularly valuable modern asset. So New Jersey really made the perfect target if the Soviet Union had a mind to be preemptive about this. So it's cool to think about, to speculate about, but it's also worth keeping in mind just how much the Soviet Union worked to keep the peace right alongside NATO and the rest of the Western world. What do you think was the most dangerous day for Battleship New Jersey? Do you think November 11th, 1983 is ridiculous fantasy? Do you think one of the actual battles she fought in was more likely to end up in the ship being lost? Let us know in the comment section down below. Battleship New Jersey receives operational support from the New Jersey Department of State, also from a number of other businesses and private individuals like yourselves. We really appreciate your support. There's a link in the description below for ways you can donate to support the museum. You can also support us by liking, sharing, and subscribing so more people find about us and our channel. Thanks for watching.